Parte 3 de la serie sobre el MMO, el futuro MMO de Riot Games. Sobre esta serie de videos que ha hecho Necrit explicando un poquito el posible universo del juego, ¿no? Posible en el sentido de que el man siempre teoriza un poco sobre cuáles podrían ser las bases del juego, a nivel jugable también, como lo que vamos a ver el día de hoy. Por ejemplo, qué tipo de voces puede llegar a tener, cómo serían las raids, ¿no? Cómo serían las... voy a decirlo para el que no haya jugado MMO me entienda, pues cómo serían las secuencias de las misiones, por ejemplo, todo ese rollo. Ya reaccioné a los otros 2 videos en el canal, los pueden buscar, escribiendo MMO allí, lo pueden ver en YouTube. Así que hoy nos toca este. Parece pan de hojaldra de aquí en México. No sé, pan de hamburguesa. En teoría es igual en todos lados. Pero vamos allá.
Well, hello there. It seems like people really enjoy it when I talk about things covered in deep layers of copium. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we're...
Coño, Necrit, pero loco, vístete. No sé, loco, siempre en pijama. Te creo yo, que estoy en Latinoamérica, no tú que eres millonario. Coño, tu madre, pues tú una ropita, ¿vale?
Writing on copium that much. So far, I have not made up a single thing. I am simply presenting things that already exist. And as my videos got traction, I started getting some valuable feedback. So before we begin today's video, let's have a look at some of the things you just had to point out. For those of you who believe we are starting unhealthy hype, it's fine. As long as we all understand that we are dealing with hypotheticals, and that we will all be bold by the time it comes out. I also got to interview the person who wrote the upcoming massive League of Legends novel, who was confirmed to now be working on the MMO. And he told me that, yes, my video...
¿Entrevistó a la chica? No. Entrevistó a uno de los miembros. ¿Cuál fue? Al autor. Aparte del equipo de Ruination, la última novela, la primera, ¿no? Una novela importante del universo de League of Legends.
Also got to interview the person who wrote the upcoming massive League of Legends novel, who was confirmed to now be working on the
MMO. Y ahora trabaja en el MMO. Hola, hola.
No.
Esto no lo sabía.
And he told me that, yes, my videos are being passed among the developers, so you can stop tagging them on Twitter now. Also, that novel is insanely good. It's Game of Thrones in League of Legends. I am excited for the potential lore of the MMO. Next, yeah, I am wearing my slippers out of my own volition. Yes, shamans can shapeshift in this universe, just like druids. And yes, Riot confirmed that Legends of Runeterra, which is the card game based on League of Legends, is a big inspiration when it comes to the world building. In case you're wondering what this is about, all the art I am showing you comes from Legends of Runeterra, a game that secretly acts as a massive archive of art that reveals this universe. Anyway, after covering the world and all the races and classes the lore supports, we can now dive into the potential endgame bosses of this MMO. Now I know what you're thinking. This game isn't even in the playtesting phase. How can we talk about the raids? Well, you see, that's because Riot was probably thinking ahead of time, and they started a bit of a meme in the lore community. They gave this universe way...
Puedo ponerlo, pero como son generados, casi siempre están todos horribles, pero creo que puedo ponerlos. No, no me deja. No. No están. Que debería estar, la verdad. No está.
Way too many world-ending threats. The downside of this is that, yeah, there was a time when we didn't know which world-ending threat was the real world-ending threat. It was a battle between who's the biggest evil. But the benefits are obvious. You have a lot of meaningful enemies that you can remove before you start limiting your storytelling. And in fact, many of these big storylines are written with all the back doors open, so that in the future they can utilize them for an event in League of Legends, or it is stories that were left open purposefully for the MMO. And that's what this video is going to be about. Originally, I wanted to show you 10 storylines that were left open and which would lead into raids. But if you look at the length of this video, yeah, I cut it down to only 7.
O sea, va a ser un video sobre 7 posibles raids que va a tener el MMO. ¿Cuál es la importancia de esto, coño? Que los raids son como mini aventuras que tienen que tener algún tipo de impacto en el lore y que tienen que tener continuación también, pues, por ejemplo, una raid tranquilamente puede ser subiendo al monte Targón y tienen que ser interesantes tanto a nivel temático por la gente que le encanta el lore como a nivel jugable porque, bueno, tienen que ser divertidas. La idea es que estés allí con un grupo de 4 amigos, y que durante ese raid, pues, obviamente haya sus mobs, sus mini bosses, toda esta chingadera, los NPCs que te ayuden. Creo que independientemente del resto de los videos, que todos son buenos, este es el que tiene más pinta de... Tiene mejor pinta para entender cómo coño, ¿sabes? Cómo sería un MMO de verdad del mundo del LoLcito.
So without further ado, let's get on it. Since we are essentially talking about the world of League of Legends, especially if you have seen our last 2 MMO videos, it goes without saying that this world has material for hundreds of instances. This means that it's really up to Riot to cherry pick which ones they want to do. And since in this video I am only going to mention 7 of these, it is highly likely I am not going to mention the one that you would like to see. But if you feel strong...
No sé, porque ya hablamos de Targón. Y por ejemplo, Targón capaz llega con una expansión, llega eventualmente en una expansión o algo por el estilo. Entonces, según lo que comenta él, ojo, una cosa es lo que él diga, que son suposiciones, ¿no? Está autorizando solamente. Lo más lógico es que las regiones principales o la historia principal gira alrededor de Demacia, Piltover y Noxus, ¿no? Pues esa sería como la base del juego. Pero sí, Targón es de las principales también.
About your own idea about the dungeon,
RPG,
feel free to comment about it below.
Sí.
This is all valuable feedback for the developers after all. Anyway, the 7 raids I picked are based on one simple fact. Their stories and setting are perfectly fit for a raid environment. Be it because their stories are set up for a grand finale, or because some of these villains already have a cast of supporting bosses for the raid. Or simply because the battles would be really cool. And because showing is better than telling, let's start with the first raid. One with such a good setup, the raid essentially writes itself. The Ascension of Mount Targon. As you may remember, Mount Targon was created by the celestial gods to serve as a gateway to the celestial realms. And people decide to climb this place for a variety of reasons. Even though only about 1 in 10,000 makes it to the peak. Some people try to climb the mountain because they want to be deemed worthy and become a celestial demigod, while, for example, the Massians send their criminals here to die trying to climb the mountain. This death sentence is called the Crown of Stone. And yes, of course, you can't really force the criminals to climb the mountain unless you go there with them. So most criminals just flee and start a new life elsewhere. Also, at the peak of the mountain, we can find Aurelian Soul, the Star Forger. The reason why he is here is because of the crown he is wearing. Long story short, thousands of years ago, when people noticed that Aurelian was crossing the stars, they started worshipping him, which boosted Aurelian's ego. And they crafted him a crown of Celestial Star Metal. Aurelian, already being quite egoistic, donned the crown, only to realize it was a mind-controlling device. In reality, it was the celestial aspects who wanted to...
No sabía eso. O sea, la corona es lo que mantiene como limitaba a Aurelian Sol. No sabía que era de mentira, o sea, que no era de él. Pensé que era algo propio.
To hold Aurelian's power the entire...
Sé todo el rollo de los targonianos con él y que lo controlan y toda la paja, pero no sabía que se le habían hecho.
Time. Now, to be fair, the aspects are using Aurelian's powers for good cause. They are using his celestial fire to purge the void from Runeterra. But still, it is the celestial aspects who enslaved Aurelian. Anyway, Riot can make up a billion reasons why we should raid this place. Though I doubt we would be able to fight Aurelian Soul at the very peak. You know, he is made out of space. But maybe we need to reach the peak to borrow some of his powers. Or maybe we need to kill a rampant aspect. Or maybe we just need to reach the celestial realm for another reason.
O sea, conseguir Aurelion Sol lo creo porque coño es el fucking, ¿sabes? El fucking Jesucristo del juego. Pero conseguirte que si las hermanas, coño, ¿sabes? Que te den un ítem especial para craftearte el arma, lo que sea. Ahí sí tiene más lógica.
Simply said, it is easy
Qué
to make up a
hermoso,
reason
qué
for
hermoso
this
imaginarme
raid
esta
to exist. What's more interesting is the setting of this raid. At different levels, the mountain presents you with different enemies. So let's start with what would happen once you enter the raid. You start at the bottom of the mountain, where you are very likely to meet Chip. Chip is an already established character who shows newcomers the wonders of the mountain. So you follow him around until we arrive at our first boss, the living mountain itself. This place has plenty of earth elementals who came alive due to the mountain's magic. Now, as I say this, don't confuse the earth elementals with Malphite. Malphite comes from Ishtal, which is quite far away from Targon. Also, he's a good guy, we don't want to fight him. But from the earth elementals who would likely protect this place, we have, for example, the Blue Sentinel, who also appears in League of Legends. But the biggest of them all...
Es increíble que todo venga del lore, loco. Increíble que todo lo que utilizo para explicar sea del lore.
...is the Stonebreaker. This one would be an excellent introductory boss. You know, you're fighting the mountain itself. And yes, I know he's a bit too big, but you can shrink him for gameplay purposes. WoW has been notoriously known for inconsistent boss sizes.
Sí.
It's fine. Anyway, after Stonebreaker, we go further up the mountain. And suddenly, we start meeting all the lesser dragons and their worshippers. The coolest of these are the White Flame Dragons. There is also an important dragon who serves as a beacon to the other dragons called Fearless Vox. But the one that could likely become a boss would be the Eclipse Dragon. That's because this dragon is quite precious to the natives on the mountain, which would be boss number 3. You see, further up the mountain, we start encountering the tribes. There are the Lunari who hide in the shadows because they are being suppressed and they are relatively friendly, just like the Rakor. But the Solari are fanatics who blindly protect the celestial realms at any cost. Even in the cinematic, you can see how they are protecting the gateway that is leading to the peak of the mountain. And even though it would be cool if Riot allowed us to fight Leona herself, champions in League of Legends tend to wear pretty thick plot armor. So instead, it would be cool if we could fight one of Leona's champions, the one known as Daylight Spear, Ravun. Anyway, after defeating the Solari protecting the gateway, we would get near the peak. The first one to meet us here would be the Infinite Mind Splitter. This is a legendary draconic creature with a very unique ability. It is told that its gaze gives you so much knowledge and insight that your mind crumbles beneath it. So fighting this boss would be all about getting buffs from it, while being careful not to get too many buffs, because it would kill you. And then, after getting past the Infinite Mind Splitter, we would arrive at the last stand of the mountain, the Arbiter of the Peak.
Coño, es cierto,
the last guardian standing in the center of the
claro, como no sirve para nada el lore.
peak, separating mortals from the celestial realm.
Es verdad, porque él es, ¿cómo se llama él en el ¿cómo se llama él? Ay, lo dijo ahorita, pero él es el que selecciona, ¿no? ¿Quién asciende, quién no.
This is the creature that leads the mortals who survive the climb directly to the Celestials. In fact,
Guardián de la cima.
He is guiding Tiari the Traveler to the Celestial Realms, where they would become the Traveler. But also, in case of emergency, the Arbiter serves as a guardian against unwanted visitors. Two things could happen here. Either we fight the Arbiter to get its approval to pass into the Celestial Heavens. In this case, perhaps the Arbiter can test us with the lesser celestial beings. Or we simply have to destroy the Arbiter. In this case, the Arbiter would probably fight us with the Golems. And finally, perhaps after beating the Arbiter, we are granted access to the Celestial Realms. And while, again, I doubt we would be able to fight Aurelion Sol, perhaps we could fight one of his creations that is endangering the world. We have two of them that stand out.
El varón, no creo. ¿Sí?
Is simply known as the Great Beyond.
Great Beyond.
Aurelian saw himself.
El más maldito de todo. El Conte 9.
Calls it
Cada vez que te aparece te quiere matar.
This is essentially a smaller celestial dragon created in Aurelian's image. So this would be like fighting Aurelian himself, except this
como
would
un
make
minor en un
sense.
sol, pues, chiquitico.
The one I believe might be a bit more appreciated, however, would be the one known as the Scourge. This is also a celestial being created by Aurelian himself, but League of Legends players might recognize this one as the pure celestial version of Baron Nashor. It is believed that the physical Baron was born out of the pure image. So, the Scourge being the final boss would be a really cool nod towards the League of Legends community. See what I mean? I just made up a 7-boss raid in a heartbeat. And I skipped a lot of details just so this video wouldn't be too long. There are the Celestial Beasts.
Claro, que hay tanto personaje que sobra. Y ya solo con lo que hizo, ya te hizo un raid tranquilamente. Ya hay un raid ahí con 10 personajitos. Ya hizo un raid completo. Sin meter es lo que estamos tratando, pues, subhistorias de Targón, que sí que las de Pantheon, que sí el propio Bardo, que pueden tranquilamente también funcionar por una raid. Por ejemplo, el Buscasagas, por sí solo, con todo el arco ese de Camphor, con Pantheon, eso puede ser una raid tranquilamente.
Consume the heavens, the dragon roost near the peak where dragons are born, the Starhounds, Esmus, the breath of the world, and so on. Designing this raid was simple because the lore and the setup is already there. Once again, I did not make anything up. All of this already exists in the universe. And Runeterra has a lot more places just like this one. So, let's have a look at raid number 2.
Número 2.
The one raid I know as a fact people would love to see is a Darkin raid. You can pull this off in a lot of different ways, but since the roots of the Darkin lore are in Shurima, the raid would most likely be in the desert. Super quickly, in case you forgot, the Shuriman Empire rose to power after it started using the Sun Disk to reflect celestial magic into their soldiers, and turning them into the god warriors known as the Ascended. The Ascended were guaranteed immortality, however their minds were as fragile as they were before. After these Ascended fought the maddening Void Beasts released by their neighbors, they started going a little bit mad. But their minds finally snapped when their emperor died too and there was no one to give them directions. The story goes that a Darkin known as Zolani, who used to be a great healer, invented blood magic and used it to heal the other Darkin, by which she also infused them with the blood magic, with a secret plan to use the blood magic later to control them all. This was Zolani's secret plan to stop the rampaging Darkin. Unfortunately, the Celestials noticed that the Darkin were very dangerous, and they started sealing them inside special weapons. The sad part is, Zolani herself was also sealed inside her blades. So since Zolani was sealed away, there was nobody to control the others. And as a nice bonus, the remaining Darkin were now empowered with blood magic. Fortunately, in the end, the Celestials sealed all the remaining Darkin inside their weapons too. But stupidly enough, the Celestials let mortals to safeguard these Darkin weapons. So of course, some people were tempted to pick up the weapons and use them for their wars. At which point, the Darkin immediately dominated the minds and bodies of those who picked them up. So yes, these rampaging god warriors managed to free themselves. So now, let's quickly go through those who would serve as big raid bosses.
¿Cómo sería esto?
Perhaps the most famous one, and as far as we know, the most powerful one, is Aatrox. After Aatrox was sealed away, his blade was picked up by a random warrior in the north. Of course, Aatrox immediately dominated the warrior's body, and since then he's been using blood magic to drain the dead around him, and make himself bigger. That's what you can see in his old cinematic. He starts small, but gets bigger the more things he kills. In fact, it got to such a point where Aatrox became the only being to ever kill a celestial god. As I mentioned in the last video, Aatrox stabbed someone wielding the power of the aspect of war so hard, the aspect of war was wiped from the stars. So out of all the Darkin, Aatrox is the ultimate end boss.
O sea, que el tío de puta de verdad mató. O sea, yo sabía eso, pero tipo que lo mató forever. O sea, mató al guerrero para forever. O sea, porque lo que dice él es que lo eliminó hasta del firmamento, ¿sabes? O sea, que desapareció la constelación del guerrero. Si no van a ser como con Valorant, vete será primero controles para claves. Sí, obviamente que se... Bueno, no sé si beta cerrada, porque es un MMO, tiene que entrar mucha gente o sea, de comienzo, pero beta abierta tendrá seguro.
Besides Aatrox, as mentioned, the second most important Darkin is Zolani. Now, Zolani has canonically not returned yet, but Legends of Runeterra is teasing that she might come back in the future. Also, as a fun fact, in the most recent cinematic...
No, ya regresó, no me jodas, Necrit. Bueno. No, ya regresó. Claro que regresó. Yo entiendo que lo suben como si fuese un what if, pero coño, más de la mitad de las cartas infieren eso.
You can see that Talia and Kaisa arrive in front of the faceless statue of Zolani. Next, there is also Varus, a Darkin who was sealed inside a bow inside a well, and he got freed after 2 hunters fell into the well. So now, Varus's body is actually occupied by 3 souls.
Varus se ve tan aburrido alrededor de los otros.
And the Darkin.
Pero tanto.
One could say he's the embodiment of 2 and...
¿Qué pasó, Mylands? Estamos viendo aquí un video de los bosses del MMO. Destruyó la existencia que antes era el celestial del guerrero. O sea que el guerrero ya no existe. Forever. A la mierda.
And a half men. And there is also Kain, the one holding the scythe of a Darkin known as Rust. But as far as we know, Kain is pretty good at resisting Rust's power. So I doubt Rust would be freed. Also, Kain is a League of Legends champion. So in order for Rust to come out, Kain would need to die.
Sí.
And I don't think that's possible with all the plot armor.
Sí, a Rust nunca lo vamos a ver como
still not done yet. Next, from the lesser-known Darkin, there is also Horazi, who was sealed inside a small emblem. Naganeka of Zurita, who was sealed inside a giant ballista. As you can see, she looks a little bit like a chicken. And that's because it is believed that a chicken touched the ballista and the Darkin took over the...
Me da risa porque esto lo teoricé yo, literalmente, cuando salió la carta y hicimos un video hablando de ella. Yo dije, coño, pero lo único lógico, si es que es un Darkin y se convierte, o sea, y algo la tuvo que tocar para liberarse, por sus alrededores tuvo que haber sido una gallina. Y yo lo dije hacia el pedo. Y al parecer es como la teoría más tangible a día de hoy.
The chicken's body. And lastly, there is Tarosh, who was sealed inside a mountain.
Ahora, no lo entiendo. O capaz yo, bueno, seguramente soy yo. Porque en Tarosh... Es Tarosh, ¿no? Creo que se llama así. En un arte de las cartas aparecen varios como él. O sea, como mini dragones, pero con semicuerpo humano y con una lanza en la mano. Entonces, yo no sé si que son varios o son como sus seguidores, pero no entiendo eso.
Massive halberd. The reason why this Darkin raid would work is because all the Darkin have a common goal. They all hate Zolani. They see her as a betrayer who was trying to control them. So in this raid, we would likely fight the other
Darkin. O sea, que Zolani es como la mala de los propios malos. Okay.
And after
Zolani es como
we kill
Madara.
her, we would face Aatrox as the final boss. Since all the Darkin wars began with Aatrox and Zolani starting a civil war. Also, it turns out that Aatrox was the general of all the other Darkin. So killing Aatrox would be the perfect end to the Darkin chapter.
El traductor traduce Aatrox como Aatrox.
But let's not forget that Riot is already teasing a new Darkin. The next champion in League of Legends might be a dog that picked up a Darkin dagger. And if you're wondering why we would raid this place, first of all, the Darkin are pretty one-sided bad guys. But we could be led here by Nasus and Sivir. Nasus is an Ascended who avoided corruption, so he would be likely happy to put down his former brothers and sisters. And Sivir is holding the very first blade to be ever used to seal a Darkin. So once again, the lore is already there. And aesthetically, we have a good idea of what it would look like too. We would start outside around the temples of Zolani, which look creepy and corrupted. And later we delve beneath them to where the land is tainted by blood and death. For the next raid, let's stay in Shurima. Because if there is a raid I would personally love to see, it is the raid on Narimazeth, a city that is in ruins. That's because Narimazeth was the place where Shurimans tried to build the very first Sandisk. This first version failed, and instead of the Ascended, it was only producing the Bakai, which are broken, twisted versions of the glorious Ascended.
Pero los Bakai, pregunto, ¿los Bakai tienen poder? O sea, sabiendo que son como una versión corrompida, o sí, como unos semi ascendidos. O sea, aún así, me imagino que son más fuertes que un ser humano promedio, ¿no? Quiero suponer yo. Nuevo personaje de LOL, Hitrox. Ya mencionaron qué roles habrán y qué serían los talentos. No he hecho video sobre eso. No he hecho video sobre eso. Ya eso es algo muy específico. Creo que si lo hace, lo al final, me imagino. Humanos que no lograron ascender. Claro, pero bueno, no sé. O sea, que llegaron a la mitad. Esa es mi pregunta. Pues llegaron como a la mitad. O solo quedaron deformados así, todos vueltos mierda. O si obtuvieron un poquito de poder, pero no completo. O sea, lo que no sé. Pero bueno, por como se ven, parece que no. O sea, quedaron en la mierda.
In the end, the entire city collapsed onto itself. After that, the Shurimans tried to build the Sandisk again, but this time in the middle of the desert. But now, why would we want to raid these ruins? Well, that's because this city is being rebuilt by Zerath, the most powerful arcane mage on Runeterra, whose body was turned into pure arcane energy by the Sandisk itself. Long story shorter. When Emperor Azir was a child, he became friends with a nameless slave. And despite slaves being forbidden from having names, he became friends with a nameless slave. Shorter. When Emperor Azir was a child, he became friends with a nameless slave. And despite slaves being forbidden from having names, he called him Zerath. Throughout the years...
Luego no sabía eso. O sea, Zerath fue un esclavo.
The two became as close as brothers, studying culture and history whenever possible. Later on, despite his father hating him, Azir became his only surviving son. So unless his mother gave birth to another child, he would become the emperor anyway. Well, in secret, Zerath simply made sure she would not give birth to another child. Usually he did it by corrupting the infant in her womb, because it turns out this entire time Zerath was trying to break his roots from slavery. And now he had the ambition to gain power himself. So he justified these murders by telling himself that he was protecting a friend. Despite his efforts, the queen did give birth to another child. So Zerath summoned a storm and let lightning kill the queen and the child. Eventually, all these events led to Azir becoming the crowned emperor of Shurima with Zerath. From this point on, Zerath was waiting for Azir to finally get rid of slavery, which never happened.
La moraleja que los esclavos siempre no, gente, no sé.
Despite Azir being the most beloved emperor in history, he allowed slavery to keep going on, and that angered.
Bueno, es que te vas a hacer amigo de un esclavo
así. At the end
así.
of the story, the emperor was chosen to become an ascended himself. But during the ceremony, when the Sandisk was focusing its power into Azir's body, Zerath was so full of his...
Pero por eso digo, porque los Bakai tienen poder, o sea, no es como que... O sea, no son cualquier huevón. A eso me refiero, o sea, entiendo yo que no son como la forma perfecta de un ascendido, pero... Coño, el fucking Zerath es energía pura que lanza... O sea, Thor se queda pendejo al lado de Zerath, o sea...
BS... He incinerated him and forced all the power of the Sandisk into himself. This resulted in Zerath's body being turned into pure arcane energy, the death of Azir, and the collapse of the Sandisk and the destruction of the entire empire. You wanna know the twist at the end? If you read the story from Azir's perspective, you learn that he did want to remove slavery. He just wanted it to be a surprise. In fact, he even announced it just as Zerath betrayed him. But Zerath already murdered way too many people, so even though he really wanted to stop, it was too late to go back.
A mí me encanta mucho decir, no sé por qué.
The entire empire. And yes, because the emperor died, Zerath is also technically the reason why the Darkin exist. I already mumbled about the lore for way too long, so just know this. Nasus's brother, Renekton, bound Zerath in a sarcophagus, and he locked himself with Zerath in a tomb. Many years later, scavengers opened the tomb and released Renekton and Zerath. As I said, Zerath is currently in Nerimazeth, and he is actually trying to rebuild the original Sandisk. We don't really know
pero esta gente no puede hablar, pana, yo no entiendo, coño. Coño, se da con esos rayitos. Coño, acércate un momentico a Sir, ¿sabes? Coño, Sir tiene poder de arena, toda la pava, ¿no? Amarran un segundo y vamos a hablar, coño, loco. Coño, loco, lo que pasó hace 1000 años, coño, te equivocaste, Sir. No fue así, mira, yo quería, ¿sabes? Eliminar la esclavitud y, coño, vamos a ser mejores amigos. Coño, tú me gustabas ser capaz, bien sabes. Y, coño, se piden las disculpas, se acaba todo, coño. Aquí como que nadie habla, aquí todo el mundo se odia, loco.
Why he is doing it, but I think it's safe to assume
no,
that he just wants more
besito.
But you know what it smells like to me? It smells like a big old setup for a future raid. In Legends of Runeterra, you can see Zerath with all his worshippers. You can also see all the mini-bosses around him. Especially, we know about Demi.
Es más, tiene más que Asir, ¿no?
But besides all of these heralds and
Asir comparte mucho otros con Renekton y Nasus.
Also have the Bakai, the original experimental ascended who come from this city. But also, we would fight Renekton himself. Because it turns out, after hundreds of years of being locked in a tomb with Zerath, Zerath broke his mind by whispering to him that Nasus betrayed him. He purposefully led him to rot in the darkness. That's why Renekton is quite crazy these days. It all goes back to Zerath, who might be the ultimate villain of Shurima.
Okay.
For the next raid, why don't we play off of the success of Arcade?
Yo no soy muy fanático, no sé usted, yo no soy muy fanático de Piltover. Es que me parece muy genérico todo. Es como Piltover, Noxus, Demacia, siento que, no sé, las partes que más me atraen del universo del LoLcito creo que son las menos exploradas, ¿sabes? Jonia, Targon, lo más celestial, pura vaina loca. Siento que lo que sería acá sería algo mucho más genérico, pero bueno. Vamos a ver.
Gain. No spoilers, don't worry. Previously, when I told you about the cities Piltover and Zone, I showed you that at the very bottom of that place you can find the ruins of an ancient Shuriman city. But that will become just a dungeon. The one that would become an interesting raid would be the Empire of Renadaglask. After I mention this, I know a lot of you will be confused. After all, Renadaglask is just a rich baron.
Yo no sé nada de ella.
How can she support an entire raid? Well, in this case, it is all built on two factors. First of all, Renada is way too big of a dungeon. But more importantly, Renadaglask released this year, and she was released as yet another big villain, after all the other already established villains in Piltover and Zone. She simply really feels like a setup for something in the future. Because after already having Singed and Urgot and Victor as villains in Zone, Riot didn't need to make up another. It feels obvious they released Renada to be a villain supervising the other bad guys.
Sí, para rellenar un hueco, básicamente.
Her, Zone
otro Madara.
Really have a
Tal cual, otro Madara.
Villain. So obviously she is now
Her
lore is making her the main boss of Zone. Her raid would be very clear in its structure. We would follow the detective case of Caitlyn and Vi as we try to find her hideout. Perhaps Camille, an extremely dangerous assassin from Piltover, would be also interested in killing her. From that point on, we would literally raid her place with the Wardens. As a nice bonus, people would love to see the popular champions Zeri and Echo on our side, both of which are kids from the streets who have destroyed warehouses before. But the last puzzle piece is, why would we raid Renada? Well, the Glask family owns Glask Industries, which is the most luxurious brand in Piltover and Zone. They sell perfumes and really fancy limb replacements. And unfortunately, this brand reflects a bit of real life, since these fancy formulas are developed down in zone, using slave labor. But there is also a darker twist. All their products are infused with a chemical formula, which can turn their customers into mindless rampaging husks at any moment. It's kinda like Apple. Now, since Renata is a recent champion, that's all her story really has. She is probably the most powerful Baron in Zone, who can make an entire city fall into chaos.
Esta mierda, es que yo no sé, no estoy al tanto, pero esa mierda es lo mismo que le... No, eso es otra cosa, ¿no? O sea, lo que convirtió a Warwick es otra, no, eso es otra mierda. No a Warwick, a Vander. La primera verga que se fumó Vander, que fue por Silco, no es lo mismo, ¿no? O es como la misma droga desarrollada, o es otra mierda. Porque ahí como que todas las drogas son moradas y verdes, entonces no sé si es la misma mierda. Ah, ¿no le ponen otro color a las drogas o qué coño madre? No tienen imaginación para las drogas.
With the press of a button. And now we're just waiting to see when she would unleash it. If you ask me, I normally wouldn't think that this would be a great raid. But this would be very different from raiding dragons, which would actually give it the benefit of changing environment. But also remember, this is riding off of Arcane's fame, and I doubt Riot would pass on that opportunity. That's why I feel confident we will meet Renata in the MMO.
Okay, ya entiendo la lógica.
And now we are diving into the top 3 raids. I am
¿Qué? Ya vamos por la mitad, lol.
Extremely confident that some form of these will be in the MMO. That's for 2 reasons. First of all, these big villains are way too big to be ignored. We are talking about characters in the style of Arthas Menethil. But also, their lore turns them into world-threatening enemies that have to be dealt with the first of these being Viego, the Ruined King. There is not a sliver of a doubt.
Ya va, que está leyendo un mensaje. ¿Cómo que Viego?
But also, their lore turns them into world-threatening enemies that have to be dealt with the first of these being Viego, the Ruined King. Okay. There is not a sliver of a doubt we will see the Ruined King in the MMO. You can point a gun to my head.
Claro, que Viego le han hecho tanta promoción y joder, tiene su propio videojuego, el hijo de puta. Obviamente que ¿Cómo la pegaron con Viego, no? O sea, apostaron tanto por un campeón sin saber qué podía pasar con él, literalmente, o sea. Porque por más lógico que parezca, o sea, por más lógico que se sienta hoy en día, capaz Viego se lanzaba y capaz, no sé, capaz la gente lo encasillaba como el típico cliché, que sí lo es, pero lo encasillaba aún más y la gente pasaba de él, ¿no? Pero lo hicieron tan... O sea, lo hicieron roto en todos los sentidos, le hicieron una historia relativamente, bueno, interesante, pero bastante cliché, pero o sea, la pegaron, pues, y el juego la pegó también. O sea, les puede salir 20 veces peor.
Tell me to guess a villain in this MMO and I will smile knowing that I survived. It would be unimaginable to ignore him. Now, the issue lying in front of me right
Tan bello
now
que se ve Viego en Lorcito.
Viego's story
Ese es mi arte favorito de Viego.
On top of the normal story he has in League of Legends, he got his own book that is 400 pages.
Y eso, tiene hasta su propio... Imagina que no tiene ni sentido. Tiene hasta su propio libro, ¿no? Una cosa increíble. Claro, no es como que sea solo... No es que hayan invertido todo en él. Ya había una historia detrás de años que se estaba construyendo y Viego fue como la cerecita del pastel que faltaba, ¿no?
The entire RPG game called Ruined King.
¿Cuánto vale esa mierda, loco? Pregunta seria. Ya va. Disculpa que lo corte, pero estoy intrigado. ¿Cuánto vale esa mierda? The Ruination. A ver. Ruination Book. ¿Cuánto vale en Amazon ahorita esa porquería? $17. 22 pasta blanda. Pasta dura. $17. O sea, $20. No es caro. O sea, obviamente es fucking caro. Pero un regalito no está mal. Yo cumplo en enero, gente. ¿Ok? Me imagino que está en español, ¿no? En España, lo de España debe tenerlo. Ah, no está caro. Está bien.
Which is focusing on his reawakening, and League of Legends got its own in-game event that was focusing
igual aquí no hay Amazon. O sea, al final del día tendría que alguien traérmelo, o sea, tendría que recibirlo por alguien, alguien de otro país que me lo envíe.
His lore forward, which also included 3 cinematics. Right now, Viego has the most lore out of any champion in this universe.
Campeón que tiene más lore en todo el juego.
Summarize it as quickly as possible. Viego was a Cameroon prince who was forced to becoming the king at an early age. Because of this, he was not ready to become a king, and many would not consider him a really good king. Still being a teenager, he often threw tantrums in the style of Kylo Ren. To keep the kingdom from crumbling, he relied on his 2 advisors, Callista and Nuno Necrit of Camavor. Yes, that's the character named after me. Eventually, Viego met the love of his life, Isolde, a woman whom he loved very, 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 very deeply. He loved her so much that he would do anything for her. But she didn't abuse it. Isolde was actually a very good queen. For the majority of Viego's ruling, he waved the kingdom's problems away just so he could be with Isolde. Until the day someone tried to poison Viego to finally remove him from the throne, and instead they poisoned Isolde. This is where Viego's dark side really started to show. After trying absolutely...
El día que tenga tarjeta de video, lo tengo, pero no puedo grabarlo con la tarjeta que tengo actual. Ya quisiera yo jugarlo en directo, me lo gozaría que no tiene ni puta idea. Me lo termino 2 días. Pero con la PC que tengo actual no me corre para transmitirlo, grabarlo y jugarlo. Pues. Puedo jugarlo yo solo. Me corre relativamente bien, pero para grabarlo no. Y me entristece, la verdad. Porque quisiera jugarlo aquí en directo.
Everything imaginable, nobody was able to heal his queen. And Viego's angry depression started taking over him. After weeks of desperate searching, Viego found out that there may exist a hidden place called the Blessed Isles, which held the sacred blessed waters
sí, which would
do anything. And so he sent Callista away.
La voy a hacer y que me la haga... Es que desconozco, pero tú tienes que comprar en Amazon. Yo porque no, aquí no hay Amazon. Pero si yo pongo, o sea, si yo hago una whitelist, no, una cosa, una wishlist, disculpe, una wishlist, una lista de deseos, pero en Amazon Colombia, por ejemplo, ustedes de afuera pueden comprar. No pueden, ¿verdad? O sea, ¿saben a lo que me refiero? ¿Se puede hacer algo así? Porque bueno, es que no sé, la verdad. No, da igual, ¿no? Porque todo viene en Estados Unidos. El Amazon que se utilice da igual. Porque mi novia tiene Amazon Colombia, pero ella compra todo desde Estados Unidos. O sea, la tienda que utiliza las de Estados Unidos. Pero paga con tarjetas colombianas. Bueno, no sé.
To find the isles.
Tengo que probar eso.
After a long adventure, Callista succeeded and she confirmed that the blessed waters did indeed exist. So on the next trip, Callista brought the queen and the king and their soldiers with them, so that they could all heal the queen and be happy ever after. But of course, there was a dark twist. The queen died before they arrived on the isles. And the priests confirmed that they can heal anything as long as the person is alive. But that didn't stop Viego from trying. So after the priests denied him entrance to the waters, Viego massacred everyone who stood in his way, and following a creepy warden called Thresh, he arrived at the waters and dunked the queen in. For a moment, the waters did resurrect the queen. But then she was turned into a wraith, who killed Viego with his own blade, which caused his soul to be absorbed by the blade. I'm skipping a lot of details here, so just know that yes, the blade can absorb souls. We'll actually talk about the blade in the next MMO video, whenever that one comes out. Anyway, after Viego was killed with his own blade, everything exploded in necromantic magic. His queen's soul was shattered into fragments, and the entire place was turned into the Shadow Isles. For 1,000 years, Viego's soul...
Sí se puede, solo que se paga con la moneda de quien hace la compra para la Wish. Tiene sentido. Gracias por la data.
...stayed there in the blade. Until the Pirate King Gangplank was told by Thresh that he could totally pick up the blade. His mind was totally strong enough to resist the power of the king. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. And the moment Gangplank picked up the blade, his mind and body was dominated by Viego, who then used that body to fully release himself back into the world. After that, even though everyone's been dead for 1,000 years, Viego still wanted to bring his wife back. And so he started to unleash the undead with the Black Mist all around the world, in an attempt to find all the fragments of his queen's soul. Eventually, he succeeded and he actually managed to bring the queen's soul back. But immediately after that, he was defeated by the Sentinels of Light. Remember the undead hunting clan?
Qué asco ese final que le dieron a ese... Qué asco, loco. La cinemática, qué triste, qué depresión que da esa cinemática de lo malo que es. Que una cosa tan estúpida, ven diciéndole a Action, distraerlo, pues yo dispararle. qué cinemática tan ridícula.
As from the last video, that's them. And not only did they permanently destroy the queen's soul, because the queen didn't actually want to be resurrected, but Viego's entire story arc ended with him being teleported back to his homeland called Camavor, where he was banished until the present days. You can actually see the end of the storyline in the cinematic called Absolution. And this is why Viego is going to be an incredible boss in the MMO. He does have a lot of story behind him, but more importantly, this entire time we have only seen his young, reckless personality, where he acts like a child throwing tantrums, as he's constantly trying to help someone he is obsessively in love with. But the thing is, his entire life he was chasing his queen. He was ready to go beyond death just to be with her. But now he was imprisoned after learning that the queen didn't want to be with him, but also after her soul was permanently destroyed. So once Viego is unleashed from his prison again, instead of a cocky teenager, we are going to have a pissed off king who has nothing to lose.
La tipa lo mandó para la mierda, se le murió ahora sí de verdad la novia. Se le acabaron literalmente los motivos para vivir. Se acuerda bien el viejo depresivo. Ese es más maldito aún, tiene lógica.
And that transformation into the Dark King is something I really wanna see. And you can only imagine what the raid is gonna look like. Hordes of risen Camavoran soldiers, ancient undead dragons brought from his homeland, the legendary Rasa the Thunderer, and even more legendary Hecarim of the Iron Order. But there is also Commander Ledros, or maybe Karthus the Deathsinger, and finally Thresh, the one who caused all of this to happen, the hidden master of puppets in the shadows. Simply said, Viego has a lot of meaningful enemies serving him, and the raid will be glorious. Side note, in the distant future, I kinda wanna cover the entire story of Viego. Wish me luck. For the next raid, we are not delving too far away from the undead theme, because it's time to cover the most brutal badass warrior.
Él hará estos videos Él hará estos videos con... ¿Cómo se llama? Con guión. ¿Ustedes qué creen? Con guión. Porque yo nunca lo voy leyendo y el tipo se nota que sabe demasiado, le sale todo natural.
This universe had ever seen. Super quickly, just for clarity. Viego's deathly magic is really undeath in its true meaning. When he's turning his enemies into undead souls, it's more like he is preventing them from dying, and he's turning them into somewhat living wraiths instead. So he's not really the master of death. As you'll see, that title goes to Mordekaiser. His story begins as a warlord known as Sun Uzal. During his time, the main continents were occupied by barbaric tribes. Sun Uzal believed that by killing as many people as possible, he would please the gods of the afterlife. And so, he forged an empire in blood and death. As his life was near the end, He took great satisfaction in knowing that he would sit at the god's tables, in the glorious halls of bones. However, when he died, he found no glory waiting for him. Instead, San Uzal stood in an empty grey wasteland, with an occasional soul drifting by. He watched as these lesser spirits faded into the fog, unmade and lost in time. But San Uzal refused to fade. His will, tempered by rage and torment, held him together. In other words, he was simply too angry to die. He started listening to the disembodied whispers around him, and he learned this was Oknun, the language of the dead. Slowly, he came up with a plan. He began whispering temptations into the veil between realms, promising power to any who would listen. And sure enough, he managed to tempt a few cultists into bringing him back to life. Lacking any flesh or bone, he told the cultists to bind his spirit to metal plates, forged in the likeliness of his old armor. And so he rose as the Revenant of Iron and Hate. No longer called San Uzal, but rather, in Oknun, he was Mordecai. Originally, these cultists wanted to use Mordekaiser as a weapon in their trivial wars. But instead, Mordekaiser killed them all, and he used their souls to forge himself a brutal mace called Nightfall. With that, Mordekaiser's second conquest of the world started. But this time, he was wielding magic. All his enemies were confused because it seemed like Mordekaiser only cared about massacre and destruction. Entire generations perished under his campaign. But in reality, there was far more to Mordekaiser's real plan. At the center of his empire, he raised the Immortal Bastion, which became the largest structure on Runeterra. And he used that place to gather information about spirits and death. Be it by...
A nivel de poder, ¿quién se coge a quién? O sea, un ascendido contra Mordekaiser, ¿qué pasa? Un Asir contra Viego, ¿qué sucede allí? O sea, ¿quién se coge a quién allí? O sea, no... Sí, ¿quién se coge bien quién? O sea, sé que Viego pudo contra Pantheon, pero bueno, Pantheon es un random cualquiera. Entonces... Un ascendido contra Viego, ¿quién se coge a quién allí? Mordekaiser se coge a Viego. No, bueno, Yasuo no metamos a Yasuo otro. Sabemos muy bien que Yasuo está en otro apartado de poder. Yasuo se los coge a todos. Pero en el mundo de los mortales, ¿quién no sería una pelea de Viego ahí contra Sir, por ejemplo? No sé. Porque siempre te hablan como los ascendidos como los más fuertes, pero no me jodas, fucking Viego, ¿sabes? Fucking Viego de repente te lanza un ledro y ¿qué haces tú? Por eso es que no sé cómo medir ese poder allí, pero bueno.
Capturing and studying demons, or torturing Yordles until he could harvest their secrets. He did everything in his power to understand the realms beyond. Eventually, Mordekaiser became such a tyrant the entire continent banded against him. But when he was ultimately defeated, it was not because of his enemies, but rather he was betrayed from his inner circle. The Immortal Bastion had a secret cabal led by a witch we know as LeBlanc. They managed to separate Mordekaiser's spirit from his armor and seal the empty armor in a hidden place. As a result, without his physical vessel, Mordekaiser was forced out of the physical realm. What none of the cultists knew, however, is that all of this was according to Mordekaiser's plan. The entire time he was forging a destiny greater than the halls of bones. When he finally returned to the empty wasteland of the afterlife, he was met by the hundreds of thousands who died under his reign. Prevented by his dark magic, they would never fade. They would be his eternal army bound to his will. But even the weakest of the spirits were given purpose. Just like he used the souls of the cultists to forge his mace, the weakest of the souls would become the building blocks of his afterworld. And so Mordekaiser became the king of the afterlife. And even though he was cast out, with his physical vessel being banished in the Immortal Bastion in Noxus, he is already planning on how to return. And once he does so, after so many people were fed into his realm, he would be so powerful nobody would know how to stop him. Since that is where his story cut off, you know that this is a setup for the future. Even in League of Legends, sometimes Mordekaiser is joked about as a raid boss. Once he starts rolling, you need the entire team to get him down. And Riot would be foolish not to use him as a badass raid boss in the MMO. Especially since we already know some of the other characters that we would see in his raid. When Mordekaiser was conquering the world the second time, he had 2 demons which he used as his companions. These would be Tybolk, the giant fire demon, and
Tybolk, yo decía Tybolk. Tybolk. Ya lo sé para las siguientes.
An iron-bound shadow demon. To get to him, we would probably have to get past the one who banished him, LeBlanc, and I wouldn't be surprised if we also met Vygar, the Yordle Mordekaiser tormented to get his Yordly secrets. Finally, we would likely fight alongside Swain, one of the leaders of Noxus who is actively trying to root out the dark magics from Noxus. So yeah, maybe Mordekaiser's story is not as long as Viego's, but Mordekaiser is built on brutal conquest. His story is simply badass, and you bet that's what people want to fight. And this takes us to the last raid I want to show you. Not only is this raid inevitable, but it is going to be the final raid before Riot starts to get sweaty about their future. Because from that point on, they would be forced into making up new enemies. And that's usually when the lore of MMOs crumbles. With the ultimate endgame in Runeterra being the battle against the end of everything. The Watchers of the Void.
Claro, the Void.
Now, I know we already quickly summarized the story of the Watchers when we talked about the world. But we need to quickly do it again, because if they get their own raid, it would be a really cool merging of multiple storylines of this universe. Basically, at the beginning of everything, there was nothing. Just dark, empty void. Until there was a spark of light. This spark of light illuminated the darkness and revealed creepy entities we know as the Watchers, who before this event didn't even know about their own existence. Of course, since this first light woke the Watchers up for the first time since the beginning of time, the Watchers got annoyed and they decided to silence it so they could sleep again. As they drifted closer, we learned that this spark was indeed our reality. So to get rid of the light, the Watchers tried to poke it and taint it, but they were always too big to get through and deal with it themselves. So instead, they reached into reality, stole something, corrupted it, and released it back, in hopes that it would destroy the rest of the reality. But even that wasn't too successful. Eventually, the Watchers started whispering into the light, and the Ice Witch known as Lysandra answered. The Watchers promised her people immortality and great power. In exchange, they asked Lysandra to prepare her world for the coming of the Void. In secret, behind the backs of her 2 sisters, she agreed. The Watchers empowered the strongest of their followers and turned them into the Iceborn. And soon enough, the Watchers broke into reality in the Freljord. With it, Lysandra's allegiance with the Watchers was undeniable. But as the Watchers rose, for the first time, Lysandra got to see how horrifying they were. And she realized they came here to destroy everything. In desperation, Lysandra sacrificed her sisters and the Iceborn to use their magic to freeze the Watchers beneath the ice. But even that magic wasn't enough. Beneath the ice, the Watchers were only sleeping. They would break out should they try to wake up. So these days, Lysandra is kidnapping the surviving Iceborn. She freezes them in her fortress. She is then using their inherent powers to reinforce the ice. And she is feeding their dreams to the Watchers to keep them asleep. As a bonus, Lysandra is killing anyone who remembers the old days, and who could spill out that she actually kinda betrayed all humanity. See, this setup on its own is enough to support a raid. Let's say we raid the Frostguard Citadel, which is where Lysandra is keeping the Watchers frozen. First, we get there by crossing the Howling Abyss. This is the bridge that is incredibly iconic for League of Legends players. This is where you play ARAM. I bet you never noticed that at the end of the bridge, you can actually see the entrance to the Frostguard Citadel. And in fact, the ghastly shopkeeper is one of the soldiers who remembers the coming of the Watchers. After getting inside, we would find Lysandra's frozen throne.
Qué locura que toda esta mierda se hizo, o sea, lo hicieron sin querer, ¿no? O sea, en ningún momento estos tipos pensaron, bueno, en algún punto haremos un MMO, ¿no? O sea, literalmente creaban historias sin terminar hasta que un día tuvieron tantas que, bueno, les dio material para esto, pero no huevo, nada. Yo me acuerdo de todo esto, o sea, me acuerdo de las teorías de hace, sí, pues 7 años, cuando el primer rework que se le hizo al mismo Lamentos, al Aran, y con los diálogos y las voces y los puse en el foro de League of Legends que se hacían sobre cada uno de ellos. Y ni Riot sabía lo que tenía planeado en aquel entonces. Y míranos ahora.
These are trolls that Lysandra twisted herself to serve her. But they are also supported by the Harbinger of Thralls, whatever that is. Then we would fight through Lysandra's army of the Druglorn. These warriors dedicated their lives to Lysandra, knowing that they are protecting the world from the end of everything. Next we would face the most mysterious creatures of the Freljord. We don't really know what they looked like in their pure form. We only know what they look like after they were corrupted by the Watchers. And these would be the creatures with their very interesting names. There is She Who Wanders, They Who Endure, and It That Stares. Whatever these creatures used to be, now they are titanic, with their eye-beam disintegrating reality. Then of course we would have to get past Lysandra herself before we arrive at the Frozen Watcher. I think it's likely that we are going to fight one of these. And what's cool is that even though this is the toughest enemy this universe has to offer, even if we defeat it, we don't really defeat all the Watchers. That's the clever backdoor of this universe. We can't destroy them all. They are the primal force, there is an endless sea of them. If anything, our reality is a parasite in their void. So if we defeat a Frozen Watcher, all we really do is plug a hole. But the Watchers continue being a threat. Anyway, this Watcher looks strange, doesn't it? It's not really the floating eye that you would imagine. Well, that's because, as it is with all the League of Legends stories, there is a twist. You see, just as the Watchers are able to corrupt a being, they are also open to being corrupted themselves. The process always comes from both sides. And so, the more the Watchers interact with humans, for example, the more human-like they become themselves. And since the Watchers in the Freljord were frozen there for thousands of years, Legends of Runeterra shows us that once they would break through, that's what they would look like. They would have many human-like limbs, the story told us they have fur from all the animals, and they even have a creepy fake face. So no, this is not what a pure Watcher would look like. This is a Watcher tainted by the people of the Freljord. Also, you might be wondering, how do we actually beat the most powerful being in this universe? Well, that's where the stories collide. First of all, Lysandra would be the key to freezing the Watchers. She would have to be on our side at the end there. Also, the primal god Ornn constructed the bridge leading to the Citadel. And this bridge was used as a magical seal to help keep the Watchers down there. So Ornn himself would help us. But most importantly, there is another massive storyline that is in Shurima, centered around a Voidborn known as Bel'Veth. Because this video is already way too long, just super quickly. You know how the Watchers themselves tainted when interacting with reality? Down in Shurima, a small pocket dimension formed between the Void and our reality. It was sort of like a cancer growth.
Pasó bastante X, ¿no?
In fact, if you dive deeper into this, you may realize that this is directly correlating to real-life cancer. If you don't know, cancer is just living tissue that decided, hey, I don't wanna die. And that's exactly what happened here. As the Void started consuming people in Shurima, it got tainted by the people and it formed self-awareness. Soon, because this cancerous growth inside the Void needed to represent itself, it grew a creature known as Bel'Veth. A Voidborn that looks a bit fishy because she consumed a harbor, But also, she doesn't actually like the Watchers, because the Watchers want to end everything. And all Belveth wants to do is to live. And so these days, Belveth is consuming entire cities at a time. And she is rebuilding everything with the information she got, with her ultimate end goal being to rebuild all reality, so that she could be reality and she would be strong enough to fight the Watchers. Of course, at this time, she doesn't really have all the information gathered, so whenever she's recrafting cities and people, it all looks uncanny. However, at this point, she consumed hundreds of thousands of people, and she's using all of their brain power, so Belveth is very smart. Now, the reason why this storyline is important is because Belveth once talked to Kaisa, and she offered her a deal. If mortals help Belveth consume reality faster, she would spare them to be the last she would consume. Belveth said that she did the calculations and she knows that humanity could never beat her. But at least, with this deal, she gave them the chance to create a weapon or maybe find a hero who maybe could slay her. She knows they could never achieve it, but she is willing to give them the chance. And you see, this is where we can get another twist. This wasn't confirmed, this is purely my theory, but I believe that there is a way to destroy Belveth. See, Belveth believes that we can't beat her, but the fact is, she used hundreds of thousands of human brains to figure it out. But the humans can't even comprehend the power of the sun.
No me jodas. Algo tiene que hacer, una mierda celestial, o el sol, una, no sé, que le hagamos una paja en el sol y el semen místico pues mata a Belveth, algo así tiene que pasar, no me jodas. Invencibles no van a ser. Yo tampoco.
So I believe Aurelian Sol.
Hermano, Aurelian Sol si quisiera los mata todos para la mierda.
Could destroy her. She just doesn't have the brain power to figure that out herself. So what I think is going to happen is that at some point we are going to beat Belveth. She realizes she was wrong, she realizes that humanity is stronger than her when fighting the Watchers, and she decides to help us destroy them. So should we ever get a raid on the Frostguard Citadel, I wouldn't be surprised if before that we got another raid, where we delve into Belveth's little pocket dimension, and with her help we move to the north. Or, you know, we just destroy her, that would be way cooler. So all of that is still just a wild theory. The fact is, we are fighting the Watchers. That is inevitable. And that was all the raids I wanted to show you. All of them are supported by the lore, and it is up to Riot whether they want to do them or not. Except the last 3 raids. Those are happening, there is no way around it. But because people are going to freak out, let me give you some honorable mentions.
Riot me tiene que invitar para la beta cuando esta mierda. Coño, su madre, cuánto falta para este juego de mierda, increíble. Falta mucho, maldita sea. ¿Qué sigue? ¿Qué sigue ahorita? Ay, falta demasiado. Entonces viene el juego de Echo, el de pelea para el próximo año seguro, el de Nunu que viene por aquí también para el próximo año. Para el próximo año tenemos como 3 juegos de ellos, ¿no? 3 jueguitos de ellos confirmados. Bueno, confirmados, pero que en teoría ya caen el próximo año. 2024 tiene que caer. ¿Estamos en qué año? ¿Estamos en qué año? 2022. 2024. Coño, un teaser tienen que publicar. Bueno, quién sabe si el próximo año te faltan un teaser, pero. Su puta madre.
This universe also technically has the Grim Reaper. While they may have many forms, the most well-known form of death itself is Kindred. We wouldn't really have a good reason to fight them though, since death isn't really...
Sí, el Kindred es un ente pasivo, pues literalmente es la muerte, ¿no? A pelear con la muerte. Bueno, Diego lo intentó.
Evil entity in this universe, but, you know, they exist. I would also love to fight against Vladimir's Henomancer.
Sí, claro.
We could also get a raid on the Earth Sign, with Volibear being the final boss, the primal god of wilderness. In the east, there is also the mysterious demon known as Ashlash, a 7-handed liquid demon that is locked beneath the earth in a place known as the 7th layer. Neela is currently wielding its power, and it looks like a setup for the future. Also, there is Fiddlesticks, the primal and most powerful demon.
¿sabes? Solo un array tipo matar a sacanas como Johnny. No, joder, hay contexto, hay lore de sobra, hermano. No ha hecho más nada sobre el MMO. Cago en su puta madre. No, es que el tipo le mete mucha dedicación a los videos, demasiada dedicación le mete.
On Runeterra. Fiddlesticks itself is just a puppet. The demon is what you can see inside the
Si esto es un guión,
because...
esto tranquilamente va a tardar una semana en hacerlo. Si todo está guionado. Si de verdad es él hablando por hablar, coño. Igual está buenísimo, pero diferente.
Because Fiddlesticks is roaming around the world, I couldn't really figure out a raid setting. But you bet we are fighting him at some point. If you want a creepy video to react to, find Fiddlesticks Cinematic. Simply said, the lore supports so much more than what I showed you today. And in the future, I can make a smaller video where I cover the dungeons of this MMO.
Qué horrible que se ve ahí.
Theoretical, of course.
Mira, no se parece en nada a la de LOL.
That's it.
¿Se acabó?
I'm running out of content, so let's see. What do we have next?
But hey, my question: why do you hold the lav mic?
Wait, what do you?
Sí, es verdad. El hijo de puta siempre sostiene el micrófono que se puede guindar acá tranquilamente. Eso es un tip. Hay gente que yo soy igual. Hay gente que necesita tener algo en la mano, para a la hora de hablar. Pues muy bueno. Muy bueno, mi rey. Muy bueno. Vamos a ponerla acá. Nos vemos en 4 años. Volveremos en 4 años y este comentario tiene que estar acá. Esperemos que sí. Esperemos que sí. Ay, gente.